finger bobs. Yuffie lifts a finger, and a mouse is there.
Another day, another mass shooting in the States at yet another school. And everyone's got their agendas that come out around this. Some people fiercely defending their right to have firearms for usually spurious reasons, but not entirely spurious reasons. Other people coming out in favour of gun control. And when you compare the statistics for America to the rest of the world, it seems an obvious argument to make, but America is not the rest of the world, and reining in gun ownership faces unique problems in the States, but that is definitely an aspect. Mental health is definitely another issue, and of course we have the battle over masculinity that goes on around all this, because it is mostly, but not exclusively, men that act out in this way. Women have ways in which they act out, which are different, less public, perhaps, less covered. So the genders approach whatever the problem is that's driving this in different ways. You know, I'm no different. I've got my agendas when it comes to this. I'm no expert. I don't have any qualifications in mental health or anything else, but I have lived some of this stuff. So I think if I kind of storytell a bit of my experience, I can at least contribute to some of these discussions around masculinity, around men's issues, around trying to find out why these things might have happened. Now, I was never a conventional boy growing up. I was into nerdy things that were regarded as effeminate and non-masculine, like, you know, reading and being good at school and not liking sport, and later on growing my hair and all the rest of it. And this despite growing up in a period where hair metal was still a thing, you know. I'm kind of at the tail end of Gen X, and I think Generation X experienced a slightly different form of a lot of what these new generations are going through. You know, the internet took off during our period. We were immensely cynical of media. We played around with image and presenting ourselves in different ways. So I think we kind of experienced a milder version of what the millennial generation is experiencing, and I think that also drives a lot of Generation X's and before's failure to empathize with millennials, because like, we dealt with this shit. What are you going on about, you know? I'm afraid that, probably to no one's particular surprise, I think a big part of the problem comes down to feminism. Some of that in ways you might expect me to say, some of it in ways you might not. Feminism has done great things for women, obviously, and everyone is on board with equal rights and so on. But whenever anyone objects to feminist overreach and so on, it's portrayed as misogyny or internalized misogyny. Rather than a liberation movement, it has become an ideological stance. Pretty much that men are bad and wrong and evil and responsible for everything wrong and bad in the world, and anything men like is necessarily bad and wrong and should be eviscerated. I am caricaturing, but only slightly. I think some of this again goes back to my generation. The whole riot girl thing was quite radical and aggressive and anti-feminine, and a lot of those girls were hot. But that cadre of feminists is probably the advent of this 3.5 wave, fourth wave aggressive feminism, and the women from that time are now in positions of power in media and so on, and in that movement, and so have bent the ideological slant of that movement. But still, great things have been done by feminism for women. choice feminism, certainly. There's been a bit of backlash against that, but it had for some time been understood that whatever a woman chose to do, so long as it was her free choice, was a feminist act. Because what mattered was having that choice. There's been some backlash against that, against choice feminism, and I think women who've chosen more traditionalistic lifestyles and so on have felt the brunt of that even before now. You know, a woman who chooses to stay home and raise the kids for whatever reason tends to get looked down on by feminists, even other feminists, if that's her choice as a feminist. But still, there's been this great broadening of possibility for women, and there hasn't been a commensurate broadening of things for men. Partly, I think this is because men are just wired differently, less adaptable, maybe, more straightforward in thinking. There's a kind of monomania that's more prevalent in men, and it's difficult to change definitions of masculinity anyway, and there has been no real effort to do so either. So like I said, when I grew up, I was very much into the kind of nerdy things that were considered effeminate and weak. The constant insults based on, you know, you're gay or homosexual or whatever else, because sexuality is very fundamental to men. A lot of men's behaviour is demonstrating masculinity to women. You don't want that to be undermined. You don't want someone to think you're gay. In crude terms, you're advertising your availability as a man who likes women and would like to have sex, have children. You know, in crude biological terms, I think that's a lot of what's going on, a lot of what drives a lot of male competitive behaviour and showiness and risk-taking and all the rest of it. It's a way of advertising your availability. And a lot of what drives that masculinity is what women want. And what women want hasn't particularly changed, even though women have changed a great deal. You know, a woman wants at least an equal or a better, it seems, from surveys on dating sites and so on. And they will very rarely consider dating or marrying someone of lower social or financial status, which is often the same thing. At the same time, job opportunities for men have narrowed, unemployment's higher amongst men. There's no real secondary role for men other than provider and so on. And that's not just financial provider. There's a lot of expectation on men to be the disciplinarian of the kids at home, to be the point of emotional solidity, the thing that can be relied upon. And I felt this in my own life when my dad left when I was 17. I became the emotional provider, if not the financial provider, for the family. You know, the guy who had to keep it together and deal with things quite often. And the stress and strain of that, I think, has contributed to my anxiety later in life. Holding it together in that way for that long trip down. That's not to lay blame on anyone. It's just the situation. But that was me performing that kind of masculinity, the point of solidity, and that became pathological. I think later, because I was so unmasculine in so many other ways. The idea of stoicism, of taking whatever the world threw at you and not letting it affect you and pushing down your emotions and so on, that was a form of masculinity that I could do. And so I clung to that because that was really the one form of masculinity, other than perhaps sexuality, that I could hang on to. But all of these things seem to be considered bad. If a man represents himself as a stable, emotional rock, he is unfeeling and distant. If he applies rationality, which is, for better or worse, considered to be a stereotypically masculine trait, the same thing happens. In terms of sexuality, there's a desire for men to make the first move and to even be sexually aggressive up to a point, provided that those overtures are wanted. But if they're not, then it's considered harassment and so forth. I mean, obviously a man should stop the moment someone says, no, I'm not interested or whatever, but by that point it's often too late. So the rules around all of this are opaque. They seem obvious when you write them down or you discuss them, but when you're in the moment, it often isn't. And any sense of leeway or opportunity to feel each other out, if you'll pardon the phrasing, seems to have gone by the wayside. You know, your overtures are either welcome or they're harassment. That's difficult for men. You combine that with all the blame that goes on, all the hatred, this narrative that men are the root of all evil, that they cannot help but be violent, that they cannot help but be sexual beasts or whatever else, blaming men, this constant talk about patriarchy and other conspiracy theories of similar ilk. I mean, you see the same thing in the racialization of things, how white people today are being blamed for things that their ancestors did, this original sin, and that goes double for men and even for straight people to an extent, or people who identify with the gender that they were commonly accepted to be growing up. You know, everyone seems to be being held accountable for things that they haven't done, that their ancestors did. Somehow they're supposed to be responsible for what their ancestors did, and that's a lot of pressure and does cause an immense amount of guilt, or equally a backlash against that, because it isn't fair. It isn't right to hold someone accountable for something that they haven't done. You know, so what if my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather owned slaves? I didn't. I found solace in the weirdos, freaks and nerds communities, in gaming, in role-playing games, in science fiction fandom, in horror fandom, in the internet, and later on in the BDSM community, which has come under attack, which is weird because consent is literally baked into that community. These were places I found fellow travellers and where I felt safe. And in the 90s through to the early 2000s, these places were safe. I mean, some of them were male-dominated spaces, but they weren't exclusively male spaces. But one after another, each of these safe havens has come under attack by these ideological types who seem to want to drag the real world into these escapist, safe and already very accepting spaces, and to hold them to account for crimes they never committed, to criticize them for art or writing or representation or whatever else, to fundamentally shift and change the very things that make these spaces and these hobbies appealing, and to close them off to the wrong kind of people, which was antithetical to how these spaces used to be. Some of that's due to the mainstreaming and popularization of these things. Some of it is due to these politicized ideologues coming into these spaces. A more paranoid person would call it entryism, but I don't think that's accurate. But the thing is, in trying to bring inclusivity and openness to these spaces, they're destroying the very openness and inclusivity that was already there. So these retreats are disappearing. These places also that a lot of men could work off their aggression and their sexuality, these are all under attack. Whether it be comics or games or sci-fi and fantasy or pornography, which is increasingly coming under attack and threat of censorship. And the more you cut off these lines of escape, the more you ostracize them, the less places disaffected men or outcast men have to work out these feelings and express these feelings. If you can't take out your aggression in a game because you'll get called all sorts of names and you'll get marginalized and ostracized, where else do you have to take it out? You know, people used to take it out in genuinely unhealthy ways, like getting in fights or football hooliganism, you know, vandalism, shit like that. And now there's far healthier ways to do this, and this is part of the reason we live in a much more peaceful society, though you wouldn't know it to look at the news, than we have at any other point before. People seem to think the opposite of what is going on is true, particularly when it comes to violence and pornography. There's no link between violence in games, movies, whatever else, and violence in real life. Just as there's no link between pornography and, you know, rates of sexual assault or whatever. In fact, there's an inverse relationship between the availability of pornography and that. And yet you've got moves in the UK to censor and control porn. So I would expect, unfortunately, that we will likely see a rise in sexual assaults and rapes. That's not to say that it's necessarily hugely healthy to work out these aggressions, and of course you shouldn't do this anyway, but if we're seeking to mitigate a problem, then we need to understand that problem, and if we can create healthy or healthier outlets for these issues of aggression and frustrated sexuality, then that's better for society as a whole. And yet this seems to pass people by. But that's kind of weak preventative care, I suppose. What do we do about people who do end up in these situations, or come to the end of their tether? I bore people constantly by talking on this channel about my issues with anxiety and depression, but it does mean that I have been through the UK mental health system and I'm well acquainted with the problems in it, from the lack of availability of treatment, which is understandable to a point because it's ongoing, expensive, and the NHS operates on triage. That means a lot of people don't get the care that they need, and a lot of the care that's available isn't suited to men. It's more talk than do. It's CBT, wishful thinking, basically positive thinking. And that's less suitable to men. There's less options available for men. If you want a private therapist who maybe specialises in men's issues, you're going to have to pay for it. When it comes to mental issues, there's also more stigma for men, just as there is with all health issues. You're supposed to be able to handle things, and if you can't, that's an admission of weakness. When I was first diagnosed, I wanted it to be a physical problem. I was insistent that it was chronic fatigue and not depression, because I didn't want to be mental. And then getting benefits is difficult if you have a mental health issue, and also carries extra stigma if you're male. And I think this is part of the reason more men end up homeless, is because they are unwilling, due to pride, to reach out and ask for the things that would help them. So in my humble opinion, I think we need men's spaces to be safe, because at the moment a woman can enter any men's space but a man can't enter any woman's space. So I think we need to make it acceptable for there to be men's spaces where men can feel free and open to be themselves, rather than constantly performing for women. I think we need to keep these kind of safe spaces, sort of nerdy things. I think we need to keep them open to everyone, to maintain the inclusivity and openness that they had in the 90s. Because, like I said before, in seeking to be inclusive and open, unfortunately these political ideologues have made these spaces hugely intolerant to anyone who even slightly steps out of line. Even fellow leftists, even fellow liberals. You step out of line to one degree, 1 point, you disagree with one thing that they say, and you could end up excommunicated. I'm as left as they come, and I'm regarded as a monster by some in the gaming space, and that's just weird. We need to broaden the concept of masculinity without feminizing it. So, a stay-at-home dad, it can be a tough job, and I think we recognize that more and more for women doing it. But for men doing it, it can be equally tough. Plus, you have to put up with people's misconceptions and emasculations of you in their minds because you're being a stay-at-home dad. We can address that. But it's going to take work, and it's going to take decades of work, just as it did for women. And there's no impetus to do this. There's no impetus to address these issues, address men's issues. Anyone who brings it up is dismissed as an MRA, or the feminist ideology has such an absolute grip on the reins of media and power that men just get laughed at for raising the issues that they have, or told to shut up and we're still dealing with women's issues, or that your issues are minor or whatever. But to me, we should have dealt with these things in tandem, because you shift the lever on one side, it affects the other side. We need to move both men and women forward together. I don't see a way to reconcile that, or to do that. We need an absolute paradigm shift in some ways, and we need to go back to a better, earlier form of dealing with these things in other ways. I don't have a lot of hope for any of these changes to take place, or in America, with reference to the shooting, for gun legislation to take place. But the underlying issue, the thing that leads the kid to pick up the gun and lash out, at least when it comes to boys, seems to be this disaffection, hopelessness, having no place, having no value, carrying the blame of everything. The weight of the world is placed on their shoulders. This legacy of guilt and hatred, and it being acceptable to hate them, at least when it comes to white boys. I wish there was a solution. I think there are solutions, but I think culturally, at least right now, we're unwilling to deal with them. Zang.